Hey guys, today we're going to be going over something that's a little different, and we're going to be reacting to some of the worst survival and prepping advice floating around. I've scoured the internet to find these scary tips people share, and the worst part about it, most of this advice is actually coming from so-called survival experts or prepping experts. If you hear someone giving out this advice that we're going to talk about today, you might want to take a second look on how much you trust this person and the rest of their advice. I'm Andrew with SHTF Honey Badger, and let's get started today. So I have my list right here we're going to be going off of. And the first item on my list here is I'll just bug out to the wilderness, or you always should bug out when SHTF happens. The reality is, in most SHTF situations, bugging out just doesn't make sense. You have all your supplies and your preps at your home. You're familiar with the terrain and the people around your home. Stay there. Shelter in place. In most situations, it's not going to be an everlasting survival type event. It's going to be something that will pass, and it makes most sense to stay in place in most situations. Now, I do want to clarify a little bit. Obviously, if you're facing something like a major hurricane or a wildfire, bugging out makes sense, but other than that, it's usually going to make a lot more sense to stay in place, and it's going to be safer. The other part of that is people that run around saying, I'm just going to bug out to the wilderness and I'll survive off the land. Do you know how many other people have that same idea? It's a ridiculous amount of people. Almost every other person you talk to out there that considers himself a prepper, a hunter, an outdoorsman, a survivalist, they're all going to say that. My plan's just to bug out and live off the land. There is not enough land in this country for people to do that. And remember, most of the land in this country is privately owned. Farmers and ranchers are not going to take too kindly to you hiding out on their land. In all reality, if you do that, you may just end up finding yourself under it with some of these people. So keep that in mind. It's better to stay usually sheltered in place, or if you do have to bug out, have a dedicated location set up and know where you're going instead of just saying you're going to bug out to the wilderness and hoping you can fly by the seat of your pants if something happens. Number 2, this one is kind of entertaining, and anybody that lives near one of these is going to understand why. And this one is that the larger the river, the cleaner the water. If you've lived anywhere like, say, for example, along the Missouri, the Mississippi, you understand right off the bat, this is a bad piece of advice. The larger the river, that means the more tributaries you typically have flowing into it. Also with larger rivers, the more people you have living around it, which means the more pollutants and waste that's going to be ending up in that water system. So running with that idea of the cleaner the water because of the larger the river, it's just backwards. You know, regardless of what water source you're using, if it's some sort of flowing water out there, you still need to filter it, and you still need to do what you need to do to keep it clean by the time it's actually hitting your lips. But relying on that idea of the larger the river, the cleaner the water is definitely not true, and that's something that's a bad piece of advice. Number 3, all you need is a gun, and then you can take what you want if something happens. The reality is most people cannot live with that, and it's not something you should plan on or be willing to live with either. Prepare in advance. Actually go out and stockpile preps and understand what you need to do if the disasters you're anticipating actually happen. But living off this piece of advice where people just walk around saying, well, I have a gun, so I'll take what I want, it's just garbage. It's amoral. It's something that you're going to have to live with yourself if you do it, and most people can say it, but you're not going to be able to live with yourself. And keep in mind, most of those people out there running around that have actual prep set up, not just firearms, they're going to be having firearms still to defend their preps. And they will not hesitate to use them to defend themselves and their loved ones. Don't be listening to that advice, because it's just a bad piece of advice. And quite frankly, I don't think most people who say it will truthfully be able to live with themselves if they follow through with those actions. Number 4, drink urine for hydration. A, it's disgusting, and B, it doesn't really work that way. If you drink your own urine for hydration, it's not a survival technique. In all honesty, it's probably going to make you sick for most people, and even more so, it's probably going to dehydrate you faster. Your body is expelling that urine for a reason, and it contains toxins the body's already processed and is trying to get rid of. And then you just reintroduce them to your body, and your body's having to burn more energy to reprocess those items it already tried to expel. And it's just going to end up more than likely dehydrating you faster. It's not something you want to do. Clean water in most situations is something that you can filter out or boil relatively easy if you're even remotely prepared. So that's what you need to plan on. Don't think that in some sort of situation you're going to be able to drink your own urine to survive. Number 5, panic, your adrenaline will kick in. I have honestly not heard this one before, but I was able to find this several places online when I was looking this up, and it kind of surprised me that people take this as serious advice, but apparently there's people out there that really are giving out that advice from what I was able to find, and that's just terrible advice. If you panic and you spike your adrenaline, you're more likely to get disoriented, you're more likely to get tunnel vision, and not be able to actually observe your peripherals, which you want to observe in situations. And if you panic, you may flee, and you're going to run through stuff. And if, for example, you're running through the woods, especially when you're in a panic, you will inevitably find that one hole in there somewhere and break your ankle or your leg. Don't panic. Keep a calm, cool, and collected head on your shoulders when stuff goes south, and think things through before you act in any situation you can. It's going to prevent you from getting hurt, and it's going to help you conserve your supplies and formulate a plan that's actually going to get you out alive. Number 6, I'll just go to so-and-so's house if something happens. They already have all the preps for this. That's a terrible piece of advice. The reality is, people, when they prep, they plan for themselves and their loved ones. Maybe they're planning for a friend or two, just depending on the situation and how much room they have, but they're not planning to have everybody show up. And that's not a burden you should be putting on other people. Don't plan on that. Get your own preps. Be ready to deal with stuff on yourself. If you have somebody you know that's prepping, work with them. Work together. There's strength in numbers, and there's strength in building a team. But don't walk around with the mentality that if something happens, you're just going to so-and-so's house, because the fact is, you're not going to probably get that warm hug you were thinking you're going to get. You're probably going to get some harsh words and getting pointed down the street saying you need to leave. So don't do that to people. That's a bad piece of advice, and don't follow it. Okay? So make sure you prep, and don't rely on other people to prep and think you're going to mooch off of them. Number 7, moss only grows on the north side of a tree. While in some cases it may be a little bit more favorable with the climate conditions and stuff in locations for it to grow in a certain direction, the fact is, moss can grow any direction. If you really think that you can rely on moss to find your way north, you're probably going to get lost. Don't do that. If you want to be able to find directions, it's so easy and cheap to get a decent compass anymore. Get one, carry it with you, and that's going to be a good way to help you find your directions. Don't rely on moss. Number 8, all you need is a .22 long rifle. This is probably the worst advice you will ever hear from these fuds running around saying, all I have is a .22 and that's all I need. Reality is, if you're worried about squirrels and rabbits, good. A .22 is going to work good to take them out, and you can use it for hunting small game. But the reality is, a .22 is not a fighting rifle. It's not a rifle you want to rely on for defense. It's a utility rifle. That's how I would look at it, and that's how you should be looking at it. You want to actually step up to something that's going to be a defense-grade weapon, whether that be an actual carbine-style rifle, or that's looking at an actual handgun with some good rounds behind it, or even a 12-gauge shotgun. While not ideal, it's still going to be a lot better than a .22. Because the fact is, while a .22 is still a round that is dangerous, it doesn't do a lot of damage compared to those other rounds. You want something that's actually going to put down something threatening you, or that you're going to be able to use to hunt big game in the event you actually do get that opportunity to hunt big game in an SHTF situation. So make sure you are actually going out and looking into some higher quality weapons platforms for your defense and for hunting. Don't just rely on a .22. It has its place, but it's definitely not a jack of all trades, and not that gun you want to rely on as your sole means of defense if something happens. Number 9, your phone is the only thing you need for navigation and communications. This one is blatantly false. I see this all the time, and I hear about this all the time with people where they go out there, they go hiking, they go camping, they go out on side-by-sides or dirt bikes, and they think that all they need is their phone. It's going to have their maps, it's going to have their navigation, it's going to have their communications, and the reality is, if your battery doesn't die and you're having a good day, and you have the right software downloaded, you might be able to get away with that, but it's not something you want to rely on. Technology like that has this weird knack of failing right when you need it. And on top of it too, especially if you're going out into more remote situations, or you're dealing with natural disasters or major SHTF situations, cell phones aren't going to work. You will more than likely not be able to get reception, or communication towers for cell phones can go down, and they are just not a good system out there to rely on. Get physical maps of the areas you're dealing with. A physical map doesn't rely on the battery staying alive for you to be able to read it. Get emergency locator beacons, especially if you're going to be going into remote areas. They're satellite directed, so if you hit the button on these beacons, you actually can get a hold of somebody, even if they're thousands of miles away and they know your location, to send help. Those are the devices you want to look into. A cell phone's great, but it's not something you should rely on as your means of communication and navigation if SHTF happens. And number 10, this is probably the biggest thing that I see people say out there, and it drives me nuts. And that's going to be, don't prepare, nothing will happen anyways, or don't prepare, you can rely on the government or other people to help you out in a situation. That is probably one of the worst pieces of advice you will ever hear, and it's mind-blowing to me how many people out there have that attitude walking around. You can't have that mentality. If anybody's telling you that, or if you're walking around the mentality, if something happens, you're probably going to die. I don't want to sound bad, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I'm just being honest. Lack of preparedness is what's going to kill you, and relying on other entities to take care of you, or just having this mentality of nothing's ever going to happen, it's detrimental. It's not going to prepare you for when something does, because inevitably stuff does happen. You know, it may not be some crazy out there conspiracy theory. It could be as simple as a tornado or a hurricane or a wildfire, but you need to prepare for that. So don't fall into that idea that you don't need to prepare because nothing will happen or nothing ever happens here, because it can go as much as to cost you your lives or your loved ones your lives, and you don't want to do that. So now that we've kind of gone over this here, and we've gone over these tips that I at least had stick out to me the most when I was looking around, I want to ask you, what bad prepping or survival tips or advice have you personally gotten from someone? Share it with us down in the comments below, and it might even make it into a future video if we turn this into a series. And on that way out, if you don't mind, hit that like and subscribe button down below. We appreciate it, but most of all though, stay safe and stay prepared.